I call this meeting to order. This is the 60th meeting of the Standing Committee on Finance. Our orders of the day, we are televised, and pursuant to the order of reference of Monday, May 14, 2012, we're studying Bill C-38, an act to implement certain provisions of the budget tabled in Parliament on March 29, 2012, and other measures. Colleagues, as you recall, last night we were still discussing Part 4 of Bill C-38, and this morning we are starting with Division 3, and Division 3 deals with P3 Canada Incorporated. We have two officials with us here this morning for this division. We want to welcome them to the committee, and if either of you, both of you, have any opening statements or an overview of this division, please do so, and then we'll have questions from members.
Perfect. Thank you. Good morning. PPP Canada is a Crown corporation mandated to lead the government's effort to improve the delivery of public infrastructure by achieving better value, timeliness, and accountability to taxpayers through the effective use of public-private partnerships in Canada. PPP Canada is incorporated under the Canada Business Corporations Act by order by Canada Development Investment Corporation. By order, it was made a parent corporation under the Financial Administration Act. At its incorporation, it was decided to make PPP Canada Inc. a non-agent Crown corporation. The Division 3 of the BIA confirms that PPP Canada does not act as an agent of Her Majesty except for certain activities. It is proposed that PPP Canada be recognized as an agent of the Crown for activities related to the P3 screen on federal capital projects, the provision of advisory services to federal departments and Crown corporations on federal P3s, and acting as a source of expertise and advice on P3s for departments and Crown corporations.
Statement. We'll now hear questions from members. Any questions? Mr. Marston, please.
One of the things that we have heard at this committee for quite a long time is the fact that there's a lot of business dollars. About $500 billion was the figure that's been quoted to us that's parked right now that people are afraid to use. I presume it's because they're fearing another credit crunch from the banks. We have said that, in this budget been described by some as an austere budget, and we have said that perhaps if the government had taken advantage of the low interest rates with the bonds where they are now and taken 10-year bonds, that they could have started a program to revitalize the infrastructure in Canada. And the Federation of Municipalities has said that there's about $120 billion worth of infrastructure that needs to be done. Would you see this organization taking part in something like that should it happen?
The role of PPP Canada is specifically targeted to supporting and encouraging the use of private-public partnerships when it's deemed that it would yield a better value for taxpayers. So to that extent, yes, it can support public infrastructure. It is destined to support public infrastructure projects that are identified by provinces, territories, and First Nations that are should be pursued under a P3 procurement approach.
Okay. That's all I have for that one. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Marston. I have Mr. Jean, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm just I'm interested in sort of a general recap of what's taken place up to now, and I know this is including the budget, but we had, of course, as Mr. Marston said, in 2004, the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, actually 2005, came out and said there's a $123 billion infrastructure deficit in the country, left by some years of neglect from both federal and provincial governments in the past. Now, of course, we came out with Canada's Economic Action Plan in 2006 through 2009, a series of investments of $47 billion, $33 billion in infrastructure, along with many stimulus projects. And of course, that type of investment was geared so that it would be a tripartisan investment, looking for provincial governments and territorial governments, along with other parties, to invest, so that we have municipalities put in a third, federal government put in a third, and provincial governments put in a third, in essence, to cap up, to get us past the $123 billion and to try to recoup some of that. Now, I know the P3 projects had a late start in getting out, but we have had tremendous response from the FCM over our projects and over our investments. And have you seen the depletion of some of that desperate need that we had in 2006 when we took over as a government? Has that changed dramatically? Would you know of the inventory of whether these projects have come forward? I myself, in Northern Alberta, we had a huge infrastructure deficit, and we still have one in relation to our Highway 63 and other areas because of the fast growth. But we have seen a tremendous investment by the federal government, almost, I think, somewhere around $800 million in that area over the last 6 years. Provincial governments as well. We've got our second, third, and fourth overpass in a number of years, which is great. And we've seen a bottleneck of the infrastructure be eliminated. Have you seen that across Canada as well?
Well, you were right to mention that since 2006 there has been major investment by the federal government. There's a Building Canada plan that provided $33 billion, of which the private PPP Canada and the P3 fund is a part of. The Economic Action Plan added to that a good $11 billion. I don't have with me analysis on the current stock of project that needs to be furthered. As you know, the government has launched consultations with provinces, stakeholders, and the Federation of Canadian Municipalities on the development of a new long-term plan that would extend beyond the expiry of the Building Canada plan. And it's in that context that the government will work with its partners on identifying the needs for the future.
And if I may, we've seen some P3 projects, particularly in Western Canada, because of the tremendous growth there. The Kicking Horse Pass, that came in under budget. It was a P3 project, public-private partnership. Came in under budget, as I say, and actually was expedited by, I think, 8 months or so. The Ring Road around Edmonton and some others that have taken place. Is that what you've seen consistently with projects, P3 projects, over the past 6 years, that they are, for the most part, coming in under budget and faster than other projects historically?
I think.
In general, it's true that P3 projects in general will achieve better value both by delivering on time and on budget. The federal experience so far has been relatively limited in terms of completing projects under the P3 Canada Fund. Only one project has been successfully completed. Others are underway. The project in question is in Winnipeg for, you mentioned Ring Road. It's the Chief Peguis Trail in Winnipeg, and it did come under budget, and I think it's almost a year in advance. But it's true that provinces have also had great experience with their P3 programs.
Okay, 30 seconds.
So, and of course, it was slow off the start because the P3 office was just established in 2006, and so getting the office, I think $2.1 billion was allocated originally. So getting things started does take some time, especially when it's a new concept, and the due diligence and accountability and transparency, the foundations have to be set up. Is that correct?
The corporation was established in 2008, became effective in 2009. There's been 3 rounds of applications. The 4th one has just been launched in mid-April. The corporation has witnessed a major increase in the number of applications submitted as the round through each round. There's been 7 products to date announced, and yes, there is a great deal of interest.
Great job. Thank you very much for your work.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Jean. I have Mr. Bryson.
very much. I want to start with Division 3. This acts to limit the activities for which 3P Canada is an agent to the Crown to the activities of Section 211 of the Act. What are some examples you could provide us with 3P Canada activities that fall under Section 211?
I would note the provision of advisory services to federal departments and the assessment of capital projects for suitability to be done under a P3 procurement approach, as well as advisory service in the execution of P3 procurement projects.
Does 3P Canada currently have activities that would fall outside of this section for which they would not be an agent of the Crown?
Exactly. It's not proposed that, it's proposed that PPP Canada may be a non-agent for the purpose of the delivery of the P3 Canada Fund, which is which provides funding contribution to P3 projects led by municipalities or provinces, territories, or First Nations.
So what would be some examples of activities that 3P Canada might be doing now that they wouldn't do after?
That they would not do
no,
after?
But are some of with the changes or these changes, are there some changes to the mandate of 3P, and what would?
There's no change to the mandate of PPP Canada being proposed. The change being proposed is to make it a non-agent for specific activities related to is what we call the federal business line. So the provision of advice to federal departments on the P3 screen, for example, and the provision of advice as well on the procurement of capital projects under a P3 approach.
But if these proposed changes in C38 weren't enacted, what's the concern that 3P Canada could be considered an agent of the Crown for any of these activities? I mean, what do these changes accomplish from 3P Canada's perspective?
It will enable PPP Canada to engage in more direct relationship with the departments in the provision of advice, similar to what we see for the Canada Development Investment Corporation, which is an agent of the Crown for the purpose of providing advisory services to federal departments.
How many projects have been funded by 3P Canada so far?
7 projects have been funded, totaling $110 million in federal contributions.
What's the status of the Muskrat Falls, the Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, Labrador project in terms of 3P Canada's role?
Which one is that?
Power transmission.
The 2 provinces, I believe, had submitted an application to the P3 Fund under Round 2 that closed in 2010. But the Crown Corporation determined that the ask was too large for the size of the P3 Fund. I believe since then the provinces have reoriented their ask to the federal government, so it's no longer being considered for funding by PPP Canada.
So it is no longer being considered by 3P Canada. Okay. And could you explain the status of the P3 screen, how that works?
So Budget 2011 announced that federal departments would be required to assess the suitability to P3 procurement for their capital projects with $100 million in spending. That's the threshold to apply the screen for assets that would have a lifespan of 20 years. For such projects, departments have to basically ask themselves the questions, could this project be delivered successfully as a P3? And for as long as this option remains viable, the option is on the table. And at the end of the day, the responsible minister or the Treasury Board, depending on the level of delegation of authority for procurement, will make a decision based on the best value.
Is P3 Canada on a consultancy basis or some other advisory type basis provide advice to the provincial governments or municipal governments? Is that part of the role from time to time?
Okay, brief answer, please.
Most of the interactions of PP Canada with provinces regards the delivery of the P3 fund. So in that respect, PP Canada helps provinces, municipalities, territories in developing projects that can be submitted for funding under the P3 fund.
Okay, thank you. Go to Monsieur Caron, s'il vous plaît.
Vous dites que jusqu'ici.
You say that until now, P3 Canada has approved 7 projects. How many projects were submitted? Do you know of any projects that were refused? As my colleague mentioned, every round has created more and more interest from the provinces and municipalities, the interested parties. For the first round, I think that 20 applications were submitted. In the second round, we had 70 requests, and in the third round, I think we had 110 or 120. The fourth wave is underway now, and I don't know how many applications were submitted up until now, because this will end in June, next June. What's the most frequent reason for refusals? Are there general reasons why a P3 will not be accepted? Well, I'd like to specify that the decisions, most refusal decisions, are reached by the corporation or its board of directors. They administer the fund. But in most cases, they don't meet minimum eligibility criteria. Many people don't really understand the P3 projects, so they don't meet the requirements. One of the purposes of the fund is to educate people on the functioning of P3 projects. Either it's not a 3P project or it's not in an eligible category under the fund. It might also be because the project is too big for the capacity of the fund. Another question. Does the 3P Canada fall under the jurisdiction of the Auditor General? Would the Auditor General be able to audit 3P Canada? Absolutely. The Auditor General is co-auditor of the activities of the fund, and the Auditor General could have a performance audit of the society. Another question. It's mentioned in the amendments that are proposed that the Crown responsibility would be limited to what's in Article 211. Does 3P Canada have activities others than those mentioned in 211? Well, our role is to deliver the 3P fund, so we must evaluate the proposals made and recommend investments. So for these activities, 3P Canada is not considered as being under the Crown. That's for 211. And in these cases, Her Majesty would not be responsible, or the government would not be responsible. That's correct. Mr. Miles?
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So the objective of 3P Canada is to promote or to look at certain projects to see if they can be a 3P project. Have you looked at the Champlain Bridge project? Mr. Lebel is responsible for the Champlain Bridge project, and since the 3P Canada can supply advice to departments, 3P Canada would be advising Transport Canada in this field. But Mr. Lebel has already decided that this would be a 3P. Were you consulted? Did you issue recommendations? If you look at the studies that were ordered by the government, we see that the 3P cost is higher than if it was paid by public funds. So the total cost paid by the taxpayer are higher if it's a 3P project. So have you looked into that aspect? Well, I'd like to specify that it hasn't been clearly defined or decided which approach would be retained for the Champlain Bridge. In the context of the development of the project, obviously we'll look at the different types of financing that would be appropriate. In this context, 3P Canada will be called upon to consult. You're telling me that it's not certain that it will be a 3P project? We'll be evaluating this proposal to see if a 3P project would create more value in this project, obviously. So even though the minister announced that it would be a 3P project, you haven't been consulted yet, you haven't looked to see what would be the advantages or the pros or cons of having such a project. Well, the minister said he'd encourage these kinds of projects if it's viable and efficient to do so. In this context, it's on our study board, and the Department of Finance is not responsible for this. The Department of Transport will be developing the project in cooperation with 3P Canada. Well, am I to understand that this has been done, or it will be done with 3P Canada? I can't speak for Transport Canada. I do believe that there are discussions underway between Transport Canada and municipality on that point. The minister also announced, to use his term, no pay, no bridge. Have you looked at the possibility of toll booths that are not linked to the 3P project? Now, you'll tell me, of course, that this depends on the Minister of Transport, but you see a link between toll booth, toll project, and the building of the project. Well, there is the intent of using toll booths for the bridge. Of course, it's a huge project. We haven't completed all the decisions, but we're looking at these aspects. Have you received the mandate to study the whole question of toll booths, how it would be applied, how the money would be used? No, the Minister of, or the Department of Finance will not be doing this. The Department of Transport is responsible. It's a sort of thing that will be submitted to 3P Canada to study the involvement of toll booths on financing. Well, 3P Canada will have to evaluate and determine if a project is to be undertaken as a 3P project. Also looks at the possibility of generating revenue. So they will be looking at that aspect of generating revenue. Now, you might not have received a clear mandate yet from Transport Canada, but have you looked at the pre-feasibility studies done for the Champlain Bridge that evaluated the fact of financing it as a 3P project or financing it in another way? Well, we're aware of the report. Have you analyzed that report? Well, yes, we looked into the report. What the report stated was that the Champlain Bridge had to be replaced and studied different options. It was a pre-feasibility study, and that study showed that it would be necessary to build another bridge. They put aside the option of a tunnel, but if I'm referring to the consortium's report that was studying, that's the report that followed. Did you look at that report? Well, all these reports showed was that there was possibility of having this project as a 3P project. We have to make other reports to see if we could have an interesting proposal for taxpayers.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I just really want to clarify that, of course, we do have financial officials here before us, and I know that there's many detailed questions coming to you specifically around, very important projects. I think we all have very important projects across the country. So would you perhaps concur that perhaps P3 might be the better place for these questions to be directed in terms of specific projects and the direction, as opposed to what the changes are that we're actually proposing in this legislation?
Fait que le ministre des Transports soit consulté ou qu'on lui pose.
Oh, the Minister of Transport should be consulted. That's the department responsible for the Champlain Bridge. They're working with 3P Canada when appropriate, but nevertheless, Transport Canada is responsible for this file.
Thank you for being here this morning. And when you do your analysis of what constitutes an appropriate P3 project, is the subsequent any potential additional fees to the public taken into account as part of an ongoing cost for a P3? Like user fees, that kind of thing.
To deliver a project under any kind of delivery method, there needs to be a funding mechanism. Mm-hmm. It's either governments who provide funding, or it's users. And in the case of users, it would be a user fee. Mm-hmm. So for any kind of project, be it a P3 or not, user fees can be considered as a means to support its delivery.
So let me be a little clearer. I mean, for example, my colleague was talking about the Pont Champlain. I'm from Toronto, and we have a toll road in our city, which was built as a P3 and has now become privatized. And the biggest complaint we hear is about the rising fees on the toll road. And so it's a different funding mechanism, as you say. If it had been built with public dollars, maybe or maybe not. We don't have public toll roads in Toronto, but it likely would not have been a toll road. So my question is, when you're projecting costs and you're comparing bids as to whether something is adequate for a P3 project or not, do you take into account the user fees as opposed to having something built through public dollars that would not require user fees? Are the user fees factored in as a cost to a P3?
There are many elements to your question. In terms of comparing bids, typically a government would decide in advance whether it wants to have an asset tolled or not, for example, or have it some sort of levy that would be raised against its expenditures. So it would not be different bidders would not propose a user fee or not, depending on their bid. So basically, this is a government decision. The procuring jurisdiction would have to decide whether they want to have a certain asset being tolled or not. In terms of whether a user fee is assessed as a cost to the project, it's more a revenue source than a cost. So I'm not quite sure I understand your question.
So if a government made the decision that it wanted to go with a P3 and not have tolls, how would the private sector make their money?
As I mentioned, to fund the delivery of projects under any method of procurement, either governments provide funding or users contribute to the funding through user fees. We have seen a lot of P3 projects delivered without the recourse of user fees at both the provincial and the federal level. And in that instance, the government will compensate basically pay for the delivery of the asset. In a P3 project, we will see various types of payments. usually there will be a substantial completion payment that is.
So just if I could, just so that I can clarify in my own mind, so you could have a P3 operation for the construction of something like a hospital, but still have it operated publicly and have no user fees, in fact. So you're clarifying the difference.
Well, in fact, for example, the government of Ontario is delivering a lot of hospitals with a P3 or alternative.
Can I just ask you one, because I'm running out of time. Are there any P3 projects under P3 Canada that are slated for the Toronto area that have been approved?
There has been no announced project yet in the region of Toronto. There has been one announced for Barrie last year. But other announcement will be made over the coming months for projects submitted under round 3. So I invite you to stay tuned.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Nash. I have Mr. Jean. You want to go?
Just very quickly.
Around you.
If I may.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, in your analysis or in the department's analysis or generally your knowledge, I did some traveling recently and over the last few years, and Australia is one of the places I've visited frequently, and seeing the toll roads there and some of the infrastructure there, I was very, very impressed. And I know those are private-public partnerships because of the polling mechanism. Are you aware of any analysis that would have been done of other jurisdictions that have had successful P3s, and have we emulated that at all?
PB Canada is the government's center of expertise on P3s, and indeed they are not only in relation with other jurisdictions that have been seen as leading the P3 delivery method. So Australia is one, the United Kingdom is another one, and clearly they do look at the best practices and lessons learned that have come from the delivery of the P3 programs in those jurisdictions. So yes, I believe that we do take into account those experience.
In fact, if I understand it, I think it's the island of Jersey or Guernsey, I'm not sure, but there's one particular island in the UK that has Colas Canada, or Colas, taking care of all their road infrastructure. Over a 30 or 40-year contract, they have tied it in for road infrastructure and also some public works. And my understanding is the performance compared to currently versus 10 years ago before they took that contract is dramatically different. And I come from, like I say, northern Alberta, where there's huge complaints about potholes because of the frost heaving, etc. And I understand with P3 projects, it seems that because of the performance necessary on the accountability aspects of the contracts with the government, the quality of I see you're nodding your head, you agree with me, the quality of the projects and the delivery mechanisms, as well as the ongoing quality of the infrastructure remains at a top level. Is that fair to say?
Indeed, the primary reason why a government would do a P3 is to achieve better value for taxpayers, and by that the procuring jurisdiction would mandate the private sector delivery agent to meet certain performance levels. So in the case of a road, that would mean like a certain service standard for patching potholes or doing regular maintenance to avoid potholes materializing. And the government basically commits to long-term maintenance of those assets via service payments to the P3 delivery agent when the case is that it's not funded by user fees. If it's funded by user fees, again, the P3 agent has to reach certain service standards so that it can collect the funding.
So they take it out of the political realm of, I don't have enough money for A and B, but I do for C and D, and they have a certain expectation. I find in my own province of Alberta, often politics is a generator of large infrastructure decisions and ongoing maintenance to roadways, etc., because of the limited amount of money and resources. So this would take that rate out, so people would have a better quality of life long-term through this type of mechanism, especially on the ongoing maintenance that you mentioned.
A key aspect of P3s is really taking the whole life cycle cost of an asset. So the decision by the government to procure an asset is based knowing the full, let's say it's a road and it will be built to last for 40 years. So the government is fully aware of what are the costs over 40 years and contracts out the maintenance of that asset over time. What we see with traditional procurement is that sometimes the decisions may be made more on the short-term cost, actually building the road, and with less awareness of what are the costs over the long term to maintain that asset. So sometimes then, let's say 10 or 15 years down the road, if finances are a bit tight, governments may decide to limit their expenditures on maintenance, and that can lead to a deterioration of the asset.
In fact, my understanding is that there's different grades of asphalt, and in fact the best asphalt is concrete. And if they use highway concrete or high-grade asphalt, they last much longer, much fewer potholes, much fewer waverings from large trucks, etc. And I see you're nodding your head, but the mic can't pick it up. So I just want to make sure that I get that on the record. That those things, I mean, they look at concrete. I think Australia, almost all the M-ways, the motorways, are all concrete now, and the quality of the roadway is just far superior to asphalt.
Basically, P3 aims at aligning the incentives in the right way to the service of taxpayers. So, for example, when you ask a consortium that's going to be responsible for designing, building, and then maintaining over the long term an asset, they make decisions that will minimize their costs over the long haul. When you ask an entrepreneur to build you a road and you award the contract to the lowest bidder, they will not propose something with concrete because it's very expensive, and because that particular entrepreneur is not responsible for the long-term maintenance of this asset. So they have no interest in proposing building the road with the concrete. But if that bidding consortium is responsible for the long-term maintenance of the asset, they may see the economies of scale and having the whole life cycle cost that we lower than having it with paving the road, for example, with lower grade asphalt and replacing it multiple times over the life of the asset.
Thank you. It makes a lot of sense.
Okay, thank you. Thought you were going to ask about Highway 63, Mr. Jean. We'll go now to Mr. Mai again.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On n'ira plus dans le pont Champlain parce que je sais.
We'll put aside the question of Champlain Bridge because you haven't received the mandate to study this report. So let's go on to something else. Mrs. Nash brought up an interesting point. In your studies concerning P3s, there's a possibility of looking at projects or where the financing can be public. Is that exact? Well, as I mentioned previously, no matter what the project is, the source of payment can be from the government, financed from general revenue, or by the person who use the project, or by both. We've seen 3P projects where governments make the payment for the consortium that will deliver the project. We spoke a lot of the fact that having a P3 project would be advantageous because it reduced costs. So what would be the advantage when the government pays or is responsible for the financing? And what's the advantage when the private sector is involved? Do you have any specific projects you could mention that would allow us to compare the two kinds of financing? And what would be the advantage of having a 3P project when the financing is already public? Well, the main difference between the traditional way of doing things and the P3 project is that there's a greater transfer of risk to the private sector in the case of a P3 project. For example, it might mean that if there are cost overruns compared to what the consortium bid, the consortium has to pay the cost overruns. Also, if there are delays in the project and the risks were transferred to the consortium will have to assume the costs linked to the non-respect of the schedule. So these are risks that are in traditional projects would be the responsibility of the Crown. So even though the Crown is paying for the delivery of the project, the private sector brings its expertise to the table to deliver the project on time and within budget. In these projects, the government would decide what kind of financing would be, for example, in user payments. Well, you could have projects that are entirely paid by the Crown. There are many 3P projects where the Crown makes the payments. in our language, we say that the Crown takes the financial risk because they guarantee payment to the private sector. Now, these guaranteed payments are subject to performance criteria. So what is built has to respect certain levels of performance that were agreed upon when the contract was signed. But you can also have projects where you have user fees. In the case of Montreal, you have a new project, Route, where the private sector pays for the construction and so on. And for Route 30, that's also the case. Thank you. Thank you.
Very much for being here for PPP Canada, and we will ask the officials for Division 4 territorial borrowing limits to come forward. And I know Mr. Marston has a line of questions on that. Thank you so much. Merci. Okay, so for Division 4, and we are on page 192 of the bill. And we'll welcome Mr. McDonald to the committee. And Mr. McDonald, if you want to give an overview of this division, and then we'll have questions from members.
Certainly. So the Nunavut Act, the Northwest Territories Act, and the Yukon Act provide that territorial governments have the authority to borrow money for territorial, municipal, or local purposes, subject to approval of Governor and Council. These identical amendments to the Northwest Territories Act in Clause 214, the Nunavut Act in Clause 215, and the Yukon Act in Clause 216 provide the authority for the Governor and Council, upon the recommendation of the Minister of Finance, to do two things. One, to set the maximum amount up to which each territorial government may borrow, and two, to introduce new regulations specifying the definition of borrowing and other instruments to be included for the purpose that limit, entities whose borrowing is to be measured, and what value should be attributed to each type of borrowing for the purpose that limit. As I said, the amendments to each of the three acts are identical. As stated in the budget on page 157, the intent of the regulations will be to ensure accurate reporting of obligations within these limits and to ensure consistency with reporting in the territorial public accounts. Establishing these clear rules will assist territories in their fiscal planning. So I will go through Clause 214 for the Northwest Territories just to show what's happening and leave it at that because they are identical for the other two territories. So Section 1 of the clause repeals the existing subsection 20 sub 2 of the Northwest Territories Act. This is the subsection that currently authorizes borrowing by the territorial government if approved by the Governor and Council. The clause replaces the current language with a new subsection that specifies that the amount of all borrowings must not exceed the maximum amount that will be set out in a new subsection 24. The new subsection 24 specifies that Governor and Council may, on the recommendation of the Minister of Finance, set the maximum amount of the aggregate of all borrowings. This confirms the current practice of establishing maximum amounts by order in Council on the recommendation of the Minister of Finance, within which territorial governments may make their own borrowing decisions. Then the new subsection 20 sub 5 creates a new power for the Governor and Council on the recommendation of the Minister of Finance to make regulations respecting borrowings, including what will constitute borrowings for the purpose of the territorial borrowing limits, for what entities or classes of entities the borrowings must be taken into account, and what value shall be attributed to each borrowing for the purpose of the limit. The remaining clause, Clause 217, is a coming into force provision, so that's an overview of the division. I'd be pleased to take questions.
Thank you very much for that overview. We'll begin with, we have Mr. Marston last time, so we'll begin with him.
Well, thank you, and welcome, Mr. McDonald. Appreciate you being here. I'm going to have a couple of comments, and it's not necessarily a question directed to you, so that don't feel you have to jump in, but I will get more specific at the bottom. When we look at this action, one has to wonder why the Conservative government is changing Constitution in these three territories to, in fact, increase control over the financial affairs of the territories without public consultation by putting them through Parliament in C-38. And I said yesterday, when I was starting off prematurely, that it strikes me as not being consistent with the government statements that the fourth pillar of their northern policy is improving and devolving northern governance. In fact, the territories, from what I understand it, are on record requesting the elimination of borrowing limit provisions. So again, one might wonder, why won't the Conservative government give the territories the same type of respect that they give to the provinces? To my mind, these changes increase almost like a colonial style governance and control over the territories, and I'm left to wonder why the government won't accord the Northerners the same kind of respect they do other provinces. In the formation of this and in the planning of this, was there a financial problem, a financial risk, or something that generated this that you know of?
To respond to the specific question, I would point to the current language, just as an example, of the Yukon Act. So I'll sort of work from the bottom of your question and maybe work back. So the current guidance that is provided for the administration of this federal authority, which has been in these acts, it's been administered since, by my record, the 1980s, reads in its entirety, no money may be borrowed under the law made under paragraph 1A without the approval of the Governor and Council. So the issue that arose that prompted a review of the operation of borrowing limits is that twofold. Territorial governments are increasingly taking on larger, more ambitious, important projects, and they're looking to finance them in using instruments that have been developed over time. So as both instruments and arrangements for risk sharing have become more sophisticated, there's not a whole lot of guidance in that line that I just read. So what we started getting was increasing questions about, well, if an arrangement looks like this, if a project looks like that, how would that be treated? As I said, there's not a lot of guidance there. So the intent is to have clear rules, and the territorial governments understand that clear rules facilitates clear fiscal planning. It's intended to clarify and to support decision-making by territorial governments. With respect to how this is administered, I would make a general comment that the structure of the borrowing limit is to set a maximum amount within which territorial governments are completely free to take whatever decisions about how they allocate the free room that's left to them. There's a parallel on the fiscal side with respect to the transfers that are provided by the federal government to the three territorial governments. They're quite significant in importance to the territorial governments. On the finance website, it refers to, for the 11-12 year, if you look in our website with respect to transfers to individual territories, it refers to an importance of 67% of financial resources of the Yukon come from the federal government. From 76 for the NWT, 88% for Nunavut. This vast majority of that is territorial formula financing, and it's transferred unconditionally. The purpose of that money is to enable territorial governments to take the decisions they need to take to provide comparable programs and services. But we don't in any way look at or influence the decisions that they take. The borrowing limit is done in a parallel fashion. We've set an amount. Within that, you are free to take whatever decisions you like.
If I may jump in just for a second, we traveled as a committee to Whitehorse last year, and in the north, the cost of infrastructure is just huge. We understand the problems that they have up there. On the other side of it is, I'm pleased to get your explanation of this, because I think the federal government has a role to play, not necessarily in this fashion, but certainly a role to play financially, because those territories cannot manage or handle the costs that they face with the roads or their telecommunications or hydro. So I presume I'm out of time?
You are, yes. But I don't have any other members, so if you wanted to have another round. Okay, I do have other members, sorry. And quite a few other members. So do you want another round, Mr. Marston, later on? Okay. Okay. Did you want to respond to that, Mr. McDonald? Okay. Ms. McLeod, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And first of all, I wonder if you could share with the committee what was the reaction of the territorial governments with the announcement that was made that this piece was included in the budget?
There were two pieces that were announced in the budget. The first was the budget stated that legislation and regulation will be introduced to clarify these rules. And certainly we've been consulting with the territorial governments since 2010 on this particular initiative, so that was not a particular surprise. And with respect to the announcement of the new borrowing limits, the reaction of the territories was set out from two of the territories in press releases that they issued on the day of the announcement of the increase, March 15th, 2012, both of which were positive and appreciative of the room that it would allow to them to make decisions about infrastructure projects. That's generally speaking.
And you did just indicate in your last statement that there was consultation. Could you perhaps share a little bit with the committee in terms of what that consultation process looked like, what it included?
Well, in light of the growing number of questions about exactly how this would work and what was intended to be included and not, a review of the territorial borrowing limits was initiated in 2010. It was conducted much in parallel with the regular workings of officials between the governments. It's been ongoing, concluded more or less to the end of last year, but as I said, it was an ongoing process, and they've been aware of what we can do.
So I think in summary, would it be fair to say that not only was there extensive consultations, but the territorial governments are pleased with moving forward in this particular area? Is that a good summary?
Well, certainly the press release from the Northwest Territories indicates it represents successful discussions between the Federal Minister of Finance and the three territorial ministers of finance.
Thank you.
Cloud, Mr. Casey for a 5-minute round, please.
Sure. Mr. McDonald, how will the borrowing limit be determined?
The borrowing limit is it's reviewed upon request by a territorial minister of finance, and the reason for that is it's left at an amount to ensure predictability for fiscal planning purposes. So you have an amount, it applies, you know what it is, because these are long-term projects that we're talking about, so you need to know what your room for a very long term is. When a minister of finance applies to our minister for an increase, the analysis that's done is around, it's in keeping with the general approach to autonomy of the territorial governments to take which decisions they wish. We look at the general economic and fiscal outlook of the territorial government and its economy. So what we consult with territorial governments on is what the forward-looking budget revenue stream of the territorial government is expected to be. We look at things like what interest rates are available or were available for existing debt of the territorial government to get an idea of what their ability to seek funds in the market is. And what you're after is a general estimate of what the forward-looking ability of the territorial government, given its economic outlook, would be to carry a given amount of debt. So it's a great deal of scenario analysis, as there's a lot of dynamic parameters in that. At the end of the day, there is a decision taken about what a sustainable level would be.
And what about inflation? Will these limits be indexed, or is that something that is a case to case? Will they be automatically indexed for inflation?
The limits are not indexed automatically for inflation. The method, if you will, for now is we set the limit to an amount, and that provides, as I said, for managing any projects over very long term. You know for all years what your limit is going to be, and if there is a change in the territory's economic circumstances, then an application to the Minister of Finance for a review would then look at those changes and what the impact on the territorial government's financial capability to carry debt would be.
What analysis has been done with respect to the potential impacts on Aboriginal governments?
I'm sorry, can you be more specific?
Well, in terms of Aboriginal governments, First Nations within the territories, has there been any analysis done to determine what impact the borrowing limits will have on them? And part of what I'm getting at is they would have land claims agreements which would be constitutionally protected.
Yep.
What analysis, if any, has been done with respect to how borrowing limits will impact on those governments and those agreements?
This is an authority that is within a federal act which describes the powers of the territorial government. So we do not conduct analysis about capacity or capability of Aboriginal governments within the territory.
So none. Okay. The borrowing limits, be interested in your comments with respect to their potential to restrict economic growth and the flexibility of territorial governments with respect to their own government programs.
There is a relationship, obviously, between a government's decision to take on debt and its ability to provide programs and services. Both of the territorial news releases actually acknowledged that link in speaking to the importance of understanding that borrowing takes away from a government's ability to offer important programs and services, and the need to balance between decisions taken today and in the future. And that's, in essence, the intent of the analysis that's undertaken to arrive at a sustainable amount of debt servicing that a territorial government can undertake. Given the Government of Canada's significant investment through other transfers in ensuring that territorial governments have the capacity to take decisions to provide comparable programs and services to the rest of Canada, that's part of the intent of the borrowing limit, is to respect that balance.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. We'll go to Mr. Jean, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm just very interested in this, and I'm glad to see this is. I'm a northerner as well, lived in northern Alberta my entire life, or pretty much anyways, and I know that one of the major complaints with my communities there is that they don't have, they're small communities, most of them except for Fort McMurray. I have quite a few smaller communities, and they kept telling me when they were applying for funds that it was very difficult to understand what people needed, and they couldn't hire a full-time person to fill out applications for federal government funding. And I see you nodding your head, so you understand this is a common complaint. So clearly, with changing the Act to be more specific, I would suggest that there's going to be more certainty, less spinning wheels, and indeed more effort put on things that actually will see a concrete and positive result. Would that be fair to say? Applications in particular?
The intention of the new regulation will be to be perfectly clear to territorial governments as they are considering various projects, and particularly how to structure them and what instruments they may wish to use to finance them, exactly what their options are.
And indeed, I think it sort of moves it from Dad knows best, ask Dad for everything, to a clear set of guidelines, including money, including the perception and expectation by the federal government in these applications. and more towards a cooperative government style with understanding of where they can go and where they will receive success. Is that fair?
Yes, clear guidelines are the objective. Yes.
Okay. I'm just sort of curious, and I'm sorry I'm getting feedback here on my mic, but what would be an average amount by one of the territorial governments that they would have received from Ottawa over the last 10 years? What would be, would you have those kind of statistics, what they would normally receive on an average over a 10-year period, for instance, prior to this legislation?
Are you speaking of total transfer funding?
Well, I'm thinking more of along the lines of these changes, and we're going to see some changes relating to this legislation. And the monies that's utilized for this, what would be, I don't know how it's transferred to the territories. I know there's a lot of mechanisms to transfer based on per capita funding and also other things. But over the last 10 years prior to this legislation, what would have they received under the same auspices and same programs as what they're expected to receive with this change of legislation? Was that clear enough?
The legislation is not going to change the amount of funding received from the Government of Canada to territorial governments, but I can observe that, as is disclosed on the Finance Canada website, if you're looking, for example, to territorial formula financing, I have figures here that read that in 2005-06, territorial formula financing was just over $2 billion to the 3 territories in total, and that for the 2012-13 year, it's $3.1 billion. Is that?
Yes, in fact, that was the point. It's not to deal with the change of money. It's a structural change to be more efficient in government and to have clearer expectations and understanding of how they can proceed and whether or not they're going to be successful or the chance of success. Is that fair to say? Yes. Thank you. Those are all my questions.
Mr. Jean, any further questions on this division? Okay, Mr. McDonald, thank you very much for being with us here today and responding to our questions very clearly. We appreciate that. And we will bring the next set of officials forward for Division 5 reporting requirements, which is on page 194 of the bill. Welcome you to our committee, and if you have an opening statement or if you want to give an overview of the division for the committee, we invite you to do so at this time.
Very well. Good morning. Just, I do have the statement to read just to indicate in more detail what we're proposing. Before doing that, I'd just like to sort of provide some context. These proposals are part of a generalized review that we've been undertaking within the Treasury Board Secretariat. Looking at reporting requirements and trying to find ways to sort of reassess them in terms of the resources that are put into creating them, and to try and eliminate where it seems appropriate to do so. So there are 3 elements here. The repeal of Section 12.4 of the Financial Administration Act and Section 28 of the Public Service Employment Act would eliminate the requirement for the President of the Treasury Board to table the annual report to Parliament on human resources management. Effectively, the report duplicates information that is available elsewhere in a number of sources, and as such, the cost of producing and tabling this report is no longer seen to represent an efficient use of resources, and also means that the information that comes to Parliament is often out of date by the time that it reaches Parliament and is available in a more accessible and timely manner through other vehicles. The next element is a new Section 151 would replace Sections 151 and 152 of the Financial Administration Act, and would create a report that consolidates the quarterly financial reports of Crown corporations and provides regular updates on the tabling of their corporate plan summaries and annual reports in Parliament. It replaces effectively the annual report to Parliament on Crown corporations and other corporate interests of Canada, which provides readers with information that is often outdated at the time of publication. The new reports would include information on the composition of government and the businesses and activities of federal Crown corporations, and the President of the Treasury Board would make it available electronically to the public 4 times a year rather than once through the annual report. Lastly, the repeal of Section 8 of the Alternative Fuels Act would eliminate the requirement to produce an annual report to Parliament on the application of the Act. This section is being repealed because the report presents the same conclusion every year, in effect, and has done for quite some time, namely that the use of alternative fuels is not cost-effective and is only operationally feasible in select areas of the country. Because of its repetitive nature, the report is of limited use to parliamentarians and Canadians, and the effort required to gather and analyse the data to prepare the report, again, represents a substantial burden on departments and on the agencies to collect that information. So those are the three elements, and as I say, represent three legislative changes that we're seeking as part of a generalised review of reporting requirements. And again, the idea being to make information more readily available through other means and not to have information duplicated annually in this manner.
For your overview, we'll start with Ms. Nash, please.
Just two quick questions. You said that the report of the President of the Treasury Board, that this reporting requirement was being eliminated because it was available elsewhere. Can you tell us where that is available?
Sources, the Management Accountability Framework contains the information which is available. Again, all departments make that available on their respective websites. The Clerk's report to the Prime Minister, which is released every year, contains that information as well. There is also a Public Service Management Dashboard, which contains a lot of that information and can be accessed. We're actually checking to see whether that can be accessed by the public. My understanding previously was that it was. But again, this information is duplicated in a number of online vehicles, if you like, which makes this information more immediately available.
So there's no advantage to having this report? It doesn't keep in one place things that are in different places, or it's all available in one place?
That's correct. The information is available in one place. I think that the advantage of again, the annual report was designed at a time when it was quite difficult to gather that information in an easy manner. Much of that information, in fact all of that information now is available in a variety of online sources and can be made available, as I say, more immediately. So it's the accessibility question, but it's also the annual reports tend to be a little bit outdated by the time they're compiled and tabled. So again, this would keep it a little bit, the information more fresh.
Just have one other quick question on the reporting requirement on the Alternative Fuels Act. One of the objectives of the Alternative Fuels Act was that starting in April 2004, 75% of the motor vehicles purchased by federal departments, agencies and crown corporations would operate on alternative fuels. Has that goal been achieved by the departments, agencies, and by the government?
No, it's not a goal that's been achieved. And again, the growing sense that it's not a cost-effective alternative means that it's going to be a very difficult goal to achieve over time, particularly given other alternates. Hybrid cars, for example, are not included in that definition, I guess, of alternative fuels. They seem to be more cost-effective, and ultimately, again, cost-effective meaning both in terms of the efficiency of the vehicles, but also the availability of alternative fuels, which is quite limited. So it's a goal which is unlikely to be reached soon.
So what you're saying is that the changing that to a requirement that hybrid vehicles be used might be a better alternative?
We're looking into whether the Act itself will be updated to reflect that alternative. As I say, in this instance, it's really just focusing on that annual report, which doesn't present new or interesting information on an annual basis and does represent a bit of a misuse of resources in that respect, in the sense that it's just there is effort and resources deployed to put that annual report together, but it doesn't bring any new information to Parliament or to Canadians.
Thank you.
You have about 2 minutes if you want to use that, or if you want to use a full round later.
No, just one question.
Okay.
Rapidement, je sais pas si vous l'avez mentionné, mais
I don't know if you mentioned it, but concerning the global report, the Auditor General had the right to audit these programs. Has this been withdrawn from the Auditor General, the right to make audits? Yeah. Why? Well, consultations with the Office of the Auditor General and the Secretariat both agreed that we could withdraw this requirement. The OHE proposed that they had other priorities than to examine. Well, these audits were done mostly on the timelines. And in the new section 151, they would include in the report all Crown corporations that do not respect the timelines for submitting public reports. So it's included there. And that's why we withdrew this requirement. You take away the obligation for the Auditor General to check this. But if he decides to do so, he can. He would have the authority to do so, I believe. Yes, thank you.
Thank you to the witnesses. I did have an opportunity to work with Transport Canada for a while during the Eco Auto rebate program, which was, well, it was quite successful in some terms. It was taken up by about 170,000 Canadians. For about $200 million, I think. Is that correct?
Honestly, couldn't say.
It is correct. At least the website says so, so I hope so. But my understanding in relation to some of those vehicles, including hybrids, is that there are some reports out that indicate that the life cycle cost on batteries is in fact much more worrisome than in landfills, et cetera, than GHG emissions. And so there's some dispute in relation to whether or not hybrids would actually be more environmentally friendly than just traditional automobiles. And I know that, for instance, automobiles today are 30 to 35 times more fuel efficient and reduce GHGs than, in fact, 10 years ago. So we've come quite a ways. But I'm interested, you know, the definition of insanity is to do things over and over again with the same result. And we've had this alternative fuels report over and over again, and it keeps coming up with the same result. What would be the cost associated with producing a report like that? And I know it's very difficult to itemize it because each department collects the data, and there must be 100 people every day looking at the data that they put into this report. But what would be the cost in actual terms that you're aware of?
You're right that it is a very difficult thing to quantify. It would be hundreds of thousands of dollars. Once I think you add up the people hours required to actually gather and analyze the data and put it together in a report. Again, it's not a huge amount, but given the utility of the report, it was seen to be a bit of a, not a necessarily cost-effective way of presenting that information. So yeah.
And in fact, printing it, having it come to Parliament, it must be in the millions of dollars, I would suggest, just based upon, I've only been here 8 years, but I see the reports and the use of them. Usually they go to my desk and then they go to the recycle bin, to be blunt. And I would suggest it would be not much different than this. I don't even remember seeing this report, but I can imagine it would come to every parliamentarian and every other person, you know, on this part of the planet. So I can't imagine the cost would be less than a couple of $1 million.
Again, I couldn't really speculate, but it is
great. I appreciate that, and whoever made that decision, I appreciate them saving taxpayers' money. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jean. We'll go now to Mr. Casey, please, for a 5-minute round.
Mr. Wise, you indicate that many of the reports that we're now relieving the President of Treasury Board from having to produce and table contain information that is otherwise available, and that's part of the rationale. Just for, I guess, completeness, can you confirm that the other sources by which they are available are public sources, so they're available to the public?
For both the information contained in for the Crown Corporation annual report, again, the idea is to have that made available through the quarterly report. So it's just a switching to a vehicle. It's breaking down the information and consolidating the information 4 times a year rather than presenting one part of the information annually. As I say, the information contained in the Human Resources Management Report, we are actually trying to compile a list and make that available as to where the other sources of information are. All of that information is available through other vehicles. We just want to make sure that when we provide that information that we have an understanding as to which vehicles contain what information. So we will provide that list.
And the other vehicles that you mentioned, these are vehicles accessible by the public?
That's correct, yeah.
Okay.
Again, I think that this is the beginning of the general review that I referred to at the beginning is part of an effort that recognizes that ultimately when many of in this instance, when the laws were put in place and the requirement for an annual report was included, was at a time when it was quite difficult to obtain that information. And so to make it available, the annual report seemed to be the most convenient vehicle for doing so. But in an increasing number of cases now, that information is available online in a much more easily accessible manner. And so, again, this is trying to recognize that it seems almost artificial to keep producing an annual report when the information in it is both relatively stale by the time that it's compiled, but is also much more instantly available through other vehicles. But again, we will make sure that those locations, if you like, if we're talking about websites, are made available so that there's clarity around precisely where that information is found.
So this decision really to drive the public to websites as opposed to having a complete consolidated report presented in Parliament, I guess my question, a general one, does this not reduce government's ability to be accountable to Parliament?
Again, our view is that the information that's provided is ultimately to help decision makers make decisions, and in most cases we have found that in many cases, because the annual reports are containing old information, they're not that useful for decision-making purposes. Also, I guess one other element that I would suggest is that many of these, I mean, I'll use these three as examples, but in general, the annual reports provide information in segments. I think what the benefit of having online information, in addition to its being easily accessible, it helps consolidate information so that decision makers are able to look across ranges of information as it's integrated and consolidated in ways that annual reports sometimes don't permit. So again, if we're talking about the ability for parliamentarians and decision makers to use that information to make decisions, our sense is that the annual report is not necessarily always the best vehicle, at least in these cases.
One of the things the amendments do is to remove a July 31st deadline with respect to presenting the results of Crown corporations and replace it with as soon as feasible. Given your comments that much of the information that comes before Parliament by the time it gets there is outdated, is not an extension such as this, removing a deadline, going to compound the problem rather than improve it?
Yeah, actually the July 31st date that was in there was an arbitrary deadline that was set asking Crown corporations to report up to that period. Now, you'll notice that there was another amendment or technical change in that section where we replaced fiscal with financial year, and that was to correct I guess a legal error when the legislation was first introduced. Crown corporations operate on financial years, which are not always aligned with the Government of Canada fiscal year. So there was some confusion on the reporting period, given that Crown corporations have different financial years, some ending in December, some ending in July. So what was effectively happening with the annual report with this July 31st deadline was you would sometimes get information that was 18 months out of date by the time the report was tabled. So what we are proposing, because the Crown corporations already have an existing legislative requirement to produce quarterly financial statements, those would be consolidated on a quarterly basis, thereby removing that reporting timeline. So the idea that we're introducing about reporting as soon as feasible is to recognize that at every quarter, Crowns have 60 days to make their information public. So once the Treasury Board Secretariat receives that information, we will compile it as soon as possible after that 60 days and consolidate it and make it publicly available. It also recognizes that as we're moving to more modern, accessible online formats, the time it will take to consolidate these reports may get shorter over time. as it stands, it takes about 60 days for the Treasury Board to produce these annual reports to consolidate all the information. So we're hoping that that will be expedient.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. Is there anyone further? Any other members with questions? No? Okay. I want to thank our officials for being here, and thank you for responding to our questions very clearly. And we'll bring the next officials forward for Division 6, Social Security Tribunal and Service Delivery. And for reference, this is on page 196. I want to welcome you to the committee, and if you have any opening statement or if you want to give an overview of this division, please do so now, and then we'll have questions from members.
Sorry, I couldn't hear what you said.
If you have an opening statement or an overview, please do so now, and after that we'll have questions from members.
Okay, thank you. So Division 6 amends the Human Resources and Skills Development Act, as well as the Canada Pension Plan, the Old Age Security, and the Employment Insurance Act to create a Social Security Tribunal, which will replace 4 existing tribunals that hear appeals related to the 3 programs that I mentioned. Division 6 also introduces a new part to the Human Resources and Skills Development Act related to the provision of electronic services. This is not related to the Social Security Tribunal changes. They're separate provisions. The electronic services provision is intended to provide the department with the authority to expand the provision of our services to an electronic environment, and to do so in a way that is consistent across the 3 programs, those being the Employment Insurance Program, the Canada Pension Plan, and the Old Age Security Program, in addition to grants and contributions which are provided under the same department. What this means really is that although with the Employment Insurance Program we are well advanced in the provision of our services through an electronic environment, we are moving towards this transformation in the pension world, specifically related to the Old Age Security Program. Right now our service improvement strategy is focused on moving these programs largely away from the paper-based environment that we currently work in to an automated world where we can use electronic signatures and electronic identity verification. So the intention is to ensure that as we expand the transformation of our electronic service provision, we do so in a very integrated and interoperable way. For example, when we do identity verification, for example, in the Canada Pension Plan, we would take the same approach that we do on employment insurance or the old age security system. So that's the electronic services provision, which is created through the addition of a new Part 6 to the Human Resources and Skills Development Act. So back to the tribunal, which is the more significant change in Division 6. Division 6 introduces a new Part 5 to the Human Resources and Skills Development Act, as I said, and the first 2 clauses have various sections in them which basically create the Social Security Tribunal, outline its structure, how its membership will be organized, how members would be appointed to the Social Security Tribunal, the administration of the tribunal, also the function of the SST, and a number of regulatory authorities associated with the tribunal. When you look at this section in the legislation, it sort of gets interrupted by the electronic services piece. We have first the amendments to the Human Resources Skills Development Act for the Social Security Tribunal, which is Part 5 of our HRSD Act. Then it introduces Part 6 for the electronic services I just explained. Then it introduces a number of amendments to the Canada Pension Plan, the Old Age Security Act, and the Employment Insurance Act, which are related to the Social Security Tribunal amendments, which are introduced in the new Part 5. So it is a little difficult to navigate through this piece, how they all sort of link together. So Clauses 225 through 250 are the amendments related to the Social Security Tribunal for the 3 programs that I mentioned. And then we have transitional provisions which outline how we will move from the existing program under the existing 4 tribunals that hear appeals to the 1 tribunal which will start hearing appeals on April 1st, 2013. After that, you have a number of clauses that introduce consequential amendments flowing from the Social Security Tribunal to other pieces of legislation that currently mention one of the 4 the existing tribunals. So it's just moving the mention of the particular, for example, the Pension Appeals Board, changing that to make reference to the Social Security Tribunal. So that is the overview of the changes that are contained in Division 6.
Okay, thank you very much for that overview. We'll start with Mr. Marston, please.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and welcome. In a previous life, I was one of the people who helped select nominees for the Labour position on the EI boards, and so I have a particular interest in this. Currently, you have Canadians who appeal departmental decisions, either EI or CPP-OAS, to separate tribunals, as you've indicated. My figures here last year said the EI tribunal heard 27,000 appeals and 1,800 further appeals to umpires, and CPP-OAS tribunal 4,500 appeals. 900 members who hear the cases at the EI tribunal alone, and the government wants to fold them together, you know, with just 74 full-time members and the backup of 11 part-time. I'd have to ask, I guess one question is, what are the commonalities that you see between these 2 groups, the EI and the CPP-OAS, that justify a joint tribunal?
The idea behind combining the 4 tribunals into one was largely driven by administrative efficiencies and improving service to clients in terms of knowing where to file their appeal. To answer the first part of your question, the members of the tribunal, in the first level of the tribunal, there will be 2 specific sections. Under the general division, there will be the employment insurance section and the income security section. So the members to these 2 sections will be separate members that are chosen with separate different competencies and different experience.
How many of them would there be?
There are, for the employment insurance side, there are 39, and the remainder are for pensions. So when we're hiring the individuals associated with these 2 sections, they will have specific skills that are required.
If I could interrupt you again, I'm sorry. Compared to today, how many would there be doing this work today? Like you said, 39 are doing it. How many people?
Well, we have over 1,000 part-time tribunal members that hear appeals from the 3 programs.
So we're going to 39 from 1,000?
Well, 1,000 is for all of the tribunals,
okay,
right? So, but they are also part-time. So the new members of the Social Security Tribunal are full-time. They will be doing this full-time. And we're also moving from 3-member panels to 1-member panel, which also accounts for the difference in the number of members.
In the past, there have been business and labor. So at this point, that will no longer be the case then?
Well, in order to be recommended for appointment to the employment insurance section of the general division, which is the first level of appeal, the current Commissioner for Workers and Commissioner for Employers, the Employment Insurance Commissioners, as well as the chair of the Social Security Tribunal, these 3 members together will form a committee that will make recommendations to the minister in terms of appointments to the employment insurance section. So there is still a component where the stakeholders of the program will have an opportunity to recommend appointees.
I guess in the past there was kind of a sense of a balance between business and labor that clearly won't be there anymore, and so we're going to have 2 different perspectives in it. What do you think the changes, what impact on regional access do you think you'd have in this? I mean, it sounds to me like if you're taking the numbers of people down so dramatically, it's got to have some impact, and have you looked into that or considered it?
Right now, the decision of where the actual tribunal panels will be located has not been determined. It's a Governor and Council decision. In terms of regional access, part of the design of the Social Security Tribunal, part of the savings expected to be realized through the proposal is related to the move away from a lot of paper-based hearings. So we're hoping to increase the occasion for individuals to have their hearings through video conferencing as possible according to the region that they reside in. So we're hoping that there won't be a regional impact.
Is my time gone already? Gee whiz. Well, my next question I can't even ask because I know it's too long. I get, pardon me?
Could have another round.
Okay, we'll pass for now.
Okay. I just wanted to clarify a couple of things on the, I mean, I very much like the idea in terms of combining. You mentioned April 1st, 2013. That's when the new tribunal will be up and operating. Is that correct? Now, I mean, I think probably the only concern one would have on this is sort of the transition period between so the coming together. Can you just address that in terms of, I mean, how exactly are you going to do the transition to ensure that it is seamless so that people who have something currently in the process, when that switchover happens, it'll be seamless for them?
Right. So the new tribunal will open its doors April 2013, as I mentioned. The existing tribunals will continue to hear and consider cases that are in their system at that time to ensure that it's seamless for clients.
So they'll finish them?
They'll phase out. So new appeals coming into the systems effective April 1st, 2013 will go into the Social Security Tribunal system, whereas those already in the system will continue in the existing system.
Okay, that's the clarification I wanted. I'll go to Mr. Casey now, please.
I just have one question, and it relates to right of appeal beyond the appeal division of the newly formed panel. Is it limited to judicial review, or is it broader than that?
We had that question. Do we have the answer? Judicial review to the federal court.
All right, so there's no appeal on the merits then. It's okay. Thank you. That's all I have.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Casey. I'll go back then to Mr. Marston, please.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate the chance to get back in. One of the concerns I have, having seen or at least spoken to people that we've had as referees before, the importance of having that face-to-face contact. I know video conferencing supplies a method, but the face-to-face where things are drawn out in a different fashion, I think a better understanding. Just, you know, do I believe the person or do I not believe the person when you're face-to-face? I'm really concerned about that, concerned about the changes to regional access, you know. And then beyond that, you have a situation where if there's so few people and it's more concentrated, for lack of a better term, understanding the region, understanding the diversity of our country, I think this has got the potential of creating problems. And when we hear the ministers talking about changes to EI and accessing EI, and I won't get into the controversy of the things that have been said on that, but from the changes that appear to be before us now on EI, I think there will be an increase in appeals as a result of that because, again, they've said that they're going to keep people, transfers will be restricted to the area that they live in and that. Well, if there's no work in that area, what's going to happen? And if a person's refusing to go or whatever, the potential for appeal. So I think this is problematic. With so few adjudicators, do you have a set of parameters you think that will be used, or are you aware of any parameters of expertise and background that will be used for them?
We're in the process right now of developing, if you will, the job descriptions in terms of the competencies, experience, and skill sets that the members would be required to have to compete for these positions, and they will require expertise in the area which they will be hearing appeals, and they will also Unlike now, they will do this full-time, so any expertise that they need to sort of hone, if you will, in terms of regional differences will be acquired through as they are hearing the cases on a full-time basis.
As I indicated before, the business and labor sides had a lot of sway in the activities. When you're setting these criteria, are you including business and labor advisors on this, or the commissioners that are there in place, are they going to be assisting?
Yes, the employment insurance commissioners are participating in.
So the labor ones would be part of it as well, and well, that's good news. I'm pleased to hear that. I don't want to sound critical of everything. It's just an example that comes to mind. You know, disability claims or appeals make up a huge amount of the workload, and to have an understanding, it's you know, you nearly have to be a medical person of some form to have that kind of understanding, and to take all of these things and condense them down into so few people, I think you've got your work cut out for you setting the parameters. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, the members, as I said, when they're competing for the position of member of the various panels, there will be specific criteria that they have to meet to be appointed. But they also, as members, when they're hearing cases, for example, related to Canada Pension Plan disability, they will have access to lawyers and medical expertise as well for their hearing and decision-making process.
It'll be like us, they'll have staff behind us.
Exactly.
Okay, that's all I have, Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Marston. I have no concern. Monsieur May.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Like my colleague, Mr. Marston, I have a certain concern about the reduction in numbers. You mentioned the fact that you'd be going from panels of 3 to 1. It would be a one-member panel. So you're also mentioning the fact that you'll be abolishing positions. Do you know how much money the government will be saving by abolishing these positions and these tribunals?
So putting the Social Security Tribunal in place are $25 million at maturity.
Merci.
Thank you. Now, these new members of these tribunals, would that include people who are already working now, or will you be getting rid of the old members and hiring new people?
The opportunity to compete and apply for the positions on the new panels.
Okay. Mais il n'y a pas de garantie ou il y a pas de...
But there's no guarantee or no direct link?
D'accord. Et
So, in all, how many jobs will be lost, including part-time? How many jobs will be abolished?
Part-time panel members to 74 full-time panel members.
Et tous ceux qui sont
And all those who are members of the tribunals now are part-time. There's nobody working full-time right now? And when you speak of
commissioners, they're full-time positions.
D'accord.
All right. And how many EI commissioners are there?
One for workers.
Donc,
so you calculate about 900 jobs lost, including the part-time jobs. If you say that you're going from 1,000 employees or 1,000 members of the tribunal to 74, so that's 926 jobs.
So we're moving from 1,000 full part-time members to 74. It's difficult to know how many of the existing part-time may possibly be participating in the new tribunal until the process of staffing those positions is completed.
Et quand vous parlez de temps partiel, on parle de quoi à peu près?
When you speak of part-time, how many hours do they work approximately?
2 full days a week.
Okay.
Month, sorry. 2 days a month.
2 days a month. Okay.
Yes.
Merci.
You.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I just perhaps want to follow up on the line of inquiry by my colleague, Mr. Mai, and certainly I've had conversations with people that are on these tribunals, and when you talk about 2 days a month, and certainly I know that they're very committed and very keen, but certainly I think anyone that does a job only 2 days a month, as opposed to perhaps being full-time in a job, the issues around training and expertise become certainly a challenge. So, I perceive, first of all, I really applaud these changes, but I think in terms of the ability to be full-time and focus versus very sporadic is going to be a great benefit to the system. Could you speak to that issue?
Yes, thank you. I also believe that part of the proposal is that by being full-time members, fully engaged in hearing decisions, particularly at the general division level for the 2 different sections, that this will also be a benefit to clients because they will get clear decisions from experts who understand the programs, and therefore I think that there's, in addition to obviously the administrative efficiencies that are associated with streamlining the program, clients can also be assured that the individuals that are hearing their cases are well familiar with these programs are like living trees. They change all the time. So you're right, keeping the part-time members fully abreast of the constant policy changes that are happening in the program is a challenge. It's a challenge to keep them up to speed, but with full-time members, they will be constantly experiencing cases associated to the policy as it evolves.
Thank you.
We'll go back to Mr. Mai.
Un petit peu par rapport à parce que Mme McLeod, je pensais plus faire d'intervention, mais
I didn't intend to ask any more questions, but now you said that people who are now on tribunals are not well trained. Could you discuss a bit the kind of training of these people? I understand that you'd like to concentrate all this into people working full time, but I think it would be a bad way of seeing things by saying that people who are working there now are not doing a good job. I simply want to clear up on that point. Could you also discuss the training of the people who are working now, even though they're working part-time? Could you discuss a bit their training? I believe these people are doing a good job right now.
The existing tribunal members are not trained. What I thought I said was that it's difficult for them to be constantly abreast of the constantly changing policies associated with these 3 programs, particularly employment insurance, which is, as you know, a labor market program. It needs to be extremely adaptable to the ever-changing and broad labor market program. So on the employment insurance side, we actually provide something like 100 annual information sessions to border referee members who attend these sessions. They are trained. As soon as the legislation changes, the information sessions are updated to provide an overview of the training. They're also provided with training on jurisprudence that is coming through the system that they may not otherwise be aware of. So yes, they are very well trained. They are giving fair decisions, but they do it part-time.
Okay, I see.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for being with us here and giving us an overview of that particular division, and we will then call forward the officials for Division 7. Thank you very much. And Division 7 deals with consolidation of privacy codes. I want to welcome you to the committee and invite you to give us an overview of that division.
Monsieur le Président, ma collègue et moi sommes très...
Mr. Chairman, my colleague and I are very happy to appear before you. I'm hearing myself. To be able to appear before the committee to speak of the protection of private information. The Budget Act would harmonize the 5 codes of personal protection now in effect. The privacy codes are there to protect the privacy of individuals under the responsibility of the department. They specify how and when this information can be shared. And this protection goes beyond the basic measures mentioned in the Act on the protection of personal information based on the very delicate nature of the information we gather.
Protections of the Privacy Act. The Amalgamated Privacy Code, which is proposed here, uses mainly pre-existing provisions from 5 different acts. And this code reinforces the fundamental value that a citizen's personal information is privileged. It will greatly streamline departmental activities and will provide a consistent approach. It will also improve the integrity of our programs. For example, the Privacy Code currently allows for the disclosure of personal information with other countries for the administration or enforcement of Canadian law under agreed-upon conditions and where the minister considers it advisable. This has been possible for the Employment Insurance Program. By bringing all the programs under the same code, this will allow us to pursue stronger integrity for the Canadian Pension Plan and old age security. As I said, this mainly uses pre-existing provisions from different acts. It appears to add a lot of new text, but the new text is appearing new in the Departmental Act and is coming from other statutes. One thing which is made more clear with these amendments is that the Departmental Act will be amended to make explicit our authority to disclose information to provinces in support of provincial activities subject to conditions and the prescription of the provincial activity in regulations. This change will ensure that operational needs of provincial programs and services will be met and will support work on important federal and provincial files such as labor market development agreements. Additionally, authority to disclose information contained in the Social Insurance Registry will be moved from the Employment Insurance Act and the Privacy Act into the Department of Human Resources and Skills Development Act. This will enhance privacy protection by ensuring that such information is governed by the same privacy requirements and safeguards as our other HRSDC programs. We're very happy to talk about the provisions in the Act.
Thank you very much for your presentation. We'll start members' questions with Ms. Nash.
Hello, thank you for being here. Just a clarification. The amendments to the 3 acts don't explicitly set out the provisions relating to the protection of personal information found in the Department of Human Resources and Skills Development Act, how it would apply to the Old Age Pension and the Old Age Security Act. Were these affected departments as well as the offices of the Privacy Commissioner and the Information Commissioner consulted prior to the drafting of the amendments?
I believe that the question has 2 parts. I'll deal with the second one first. We did consult the Office of the Privacy Commissioner, and the code which is contained in the Departmental Act actually dates from several years, and the Office of the Privacy Commissioner was consulted at the time. In bringing forward this harmonization, we have consulted the office again, and they have not raised any specific concerns with respect to the harmonization that we're proposing. I believe that the first part of the question dealt with how CPP and OAS are being folded into this. You're right, it doesn't, since this is a harmonization, this does not show the sections of the Act that are already there. What this does is this essentially takes pieces out of the CPP and OAS Act, move them into the Departmental Act, harmonizing them all together, which has the result of ensuring that that code applies consistently across our programs.
so that the same protections of personal information would apply.
That's correct.
And can you just clarify again the rationale behind that change?
Well, in a general way, it has been administratively interesting to deal with programs that are for which the personal information is protected under a bunch of different pieces of legislation, and the same standards have not applied across the different programs. So in order to facilitate administration so that we are always consulting one code instead of several pieces of information, and to ensure that the same standards apply, that's the rationale for bringing them together.
Okay, that's all my questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Nash. Okay, we'll go to Mr. Casey, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My first question just relates to the wording that's employed here. The wording that previously existed was protection of personal information, and now the wording that we see is availability of information. Can you just lay out the rationale for that change? I presume there's some real legal significance.
I believe that you are perhaps referring to 292.
Yeah.
And this just reflects the consequential nature of these amendments. Since it is taking the protections that were contained in the CPP Act and moving them into the Departmental Act, the protections are retained, but what is left over in the other act no longer deals with protection, so the heading of the section changes, because what's left in the other act just deals with availability. But the protections are maintained and moved into the Departmental Act.
Okay, and you indicated in response to an earlier question that the Privacy Commissioner had been consulted. Is that also the case with respect to the Information Commissioner?
I want to clarify, we have consulted the Office of the Privacy Commissioner, not the Commissioner herself. We did not consult the Office of the Information Commissioner.
Okay.
These amendments deal with protecting information, and the Information Commissioner deals with ensuring that Canadians have access to information about their government and their programs. So we didn't have a reason to consult the Information Commissioner.
You touched on it in your opening remarks, but I'd invite you to expand on impacts on the provinces and territories of these changes.
The provinces and territories won't be so much impacted, because what this does is it simply makes clear an authority for us to share information as needed to support programs that we're working with in the provinces and the territories. So work that has been going on should continue as it has in the past. What it does explicitly is it adds the word provincial activity. Before it talked about provincial laws. Some provincial programs, such as the work that they do on labor market development agreements, don't necessarily have a specific law in the province related to that activity. So it adds the word activity to make our authority clearer. And any of those activities will have to be listed in regulation, in federal regulation, to ensure that protections are in place.
And the whole objective here, I presume it's to save money, or is it just to clean up the multiple codes that you have?
I would say that it's the second of the two. The privacy protections that exist and that we administer have developed over the years as the department has gone through various manifestations, and as our programs have been developed and come online. And now in 2012, it makes sense to harmonize and bring together the codes to ensure consistent application of privacy protection.
So you don't expect to see any savings?
No. No, it will.
That's not the goal.
It will make some of our work easier, and my colleague and I may spend an hour on something rather than 2 hours on something, so we save a little bit of.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I have no further questions on this division, so I want to thank you for being with us here today and responding to our questions in your presentation. And we'll now call the next set of officials for Division 8 social insurance number cards. And that's on page 235 of the budget. Point of order, Mr. Hovack.
Chair, I'm just kind of considering we've been here for a couple hours now. If we could just break for 10 minutes so we can return
Suspend?
phone calls.
Okay,
for a few
I
minutes.
will suspend, allow colleagues to take a bit of a break, and we'll come back in 2 minutes.
Okay.
Okay, I'll call this meeting back to order, the 60th meeting of the Standing Committee on Finance, continuing our study of Bill C-38. And we are in Part 4, and we are at Division 8, Social Insurance Number Cards. I want to welcome Mr. Boyd to the committee and ask him if he can give us an overview of this division, and then we'll have some questions from members.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. This particular section of the Act runs from Clause 304 to 314. And so in the context of the presentation you just heard from my colleagues about moving various pieces of the EI Act into the Departmental Act, the text that you see in these sections reflects that move, okay, just because it's happening at the same time, but makes some additional changes to some of that text to deal with the social insurance number card. It's being proposed to eliminate the production and issuance of the social insurance number card as of March 2014. So we would stop printing the card at that point. This would yield savings in the range of $1.5 million. Fundamentally, we don't require the card for service delivery. It's the number that is the key piece within our service delivery framework. The card is merely a reminder of that number. So, as of March 2014, we'll be replacing the card with a letter, which is more efficient and easier for us to print. So that's the main piece within this section. There's also some consequential changes to some other pieces of legislation relating to the Wheat Board, Farm Income Protection Act, Immigration Refugee Act, and Wage Earner Protection Program Act, because they all make mention of the card, and so those changes strictly to reflect that. The Section 307 talks about money, and it merely maintains the source of funding for the Social Insurance Register and Card, the program around Social Insurance Number. It maintains the status quo from what was before, recognizing the change in the Act. And there's also a consequential change in this Canada Pension Plan Act, as it also makes reference to the card and actually requires the card to be presented to an employer within 60 days. So that's been changed to say the number must be given to the employer within 60 days for the employer to then report it on the various documents that they require to do it. So at high level, that is what this section is proposing.
Okay, thank you very much for that. We'll start avec Monsieur Caron for 5 minutes.
Merci.
Thank you. Well, I do have a question. When I look at Section 2825, it mentions that the Commission can identify people and give them to use these social insurance numbers and make available information contained in the register. What are the guidelines that determine to whom the Commission can divulge this information?
Change caused the set amendment. The Commission is able to make information available for the purpose of effective identification of the client and for their effective use of the social insurance number. So those are two terms that give the high-level guidelines, and then any decision that the Commission makes is then also guided by the rest of the legislation that they talked about previously around privacy, the Privacy Act, as well as a number of other acts of Parliament which provide authority for that particular program to use the social insurance number. For example, Income Tax Act authorizes CRA to use the social insurance number, and therefore disclosing that information to CRA for those purposes is allowed under the Act. So it's in that way.
La deuxième question que j'avais, c'est que j'étais sous l'impression qu'il existe.
My second question, I believed that there was already a register. So we have our cards, and so I'm surprised that to find out that there wasn't a register. Concerning the creation of this register, what kind of information will be necessary to be included in there? The number, the name of the person, but what will be the information required to identify a person?
Insurance register does exist. It was created in 1964 when the social insurance number was originally created. So that does not change in this amendment. And so that is very much status quo. The information that's contained in that register, I don't have an exhaustive list here, but obviously it's the name, it's the address we sent the letter or the card to, it's date of birth, gender, those sorts of pieces, as well as a few administrative data things, whether or not the person has been declared dead, whether or not they've not used it in several years. So a lot of administrative sort of flags that are also in there. So that's the nature of the information that is in the register and has been for many years. Okay.
I just wanted to follow up on one point. My understanding is one of the reasons for doing this is for security, for identity theft reasons. It's an issue I've worked on for years. So just, is my understanding correct on that, Mr. Boyd?
Yes, that is correct. The social insurance number card is simply a piece of plastic with your name, number punched into it, and some ink. It's something that is very easy to, an enterprising grade 12 12th grader could do it in their parents' basement without the parents even knowing. So it doesn't provide any security. And so moving away from reliance on the card provides benefits from an identity theft perspective.
Okay. And do you have just maybe your suggestions from Service Canada's point of view with respect to keeping the document secure both electronically, where your advice would be to how to keep electronically, and also, I mean, I'm thinking of seniors. A lot of seniors still keep things in paper form. Mm-hmm. So do you have any advice from Service Canada's point of view in terms of how Canadians where they should keep their SIN number, how they should keep it secure?
Certainly, and in fact, on the Service Canada website, under the heading of social insurance number, there's in fact a booklet that's called, well, there's a couple of booklets, one specifically on protecting your information, and one's also a code of conduct, is what we call it, about how not just individuals are supposed to use social insurance number, but how businesses and government and that should use the social insurance number. And so it makes recommendations for people to, not carry it in your wallet. Safe deposit box is a good place for it. Don't give it to someone unless you actually need to. I.e., if you're applying for EI, you must provide it because that's what it's for. But you hear a lot of examples of people being asked to give it for renting a house or for getting a video. I guess we don't do that anymore. Get a card to rent videos at your local store. Those would not be reasons for which the number was created, and so we advise Canadians to be cautious about using it in that way. But that information is readily available on the website, yes.
Okay, I appreciate that. That's helpful. Are there any other members with questions? Mr. Bryson?
How does the whole emerging issue of identity theft affect this decision to establish a registry and to I guess I guess the expectation would have been that we already were doing this. People would have already thought we were doing this currently. But if you could help inform us as to how the issue of identity theft informs the decision to make these changes.
Sorry, people would have already thought we were doing what?
Well,
sorry.
No, but these changes, to what extent does the issue of identity theft help inform the decision to make these changes?
It's one of a variety of considerations that that we've taken into account. It is an initiative that's been discussed in the department for quite some time. More and more, we recognize that the physical card is not required for us to do our business and for our other government departments to do their business. And so phasing it out in that context makes a lot of sense. In terms of identity theft, that too is a consideration. It's not the only consideration, but obviously a department such as HRSDC is very attuned to issues around privacy of personal information, as my colleagues were just saying about the changes to the privacy framework for the department. Safeguarding that personal information is primordial. So anything we can do to reduce the opportunities for identity theft, the better. And so, which is one of the reasons why we also encourage people not to use it inappropriately, because the number becomes available widely, then the more someone is able to take advantage of it. And by issuing a card, people will become relying on the card as a piece of identity document, and we, of course, do not encourage the use of the card as an identity document, given it has no security features on it, and no picture of the holder, no fingerprint, no retina scan, or anything along that line.
Is the change informed by a recognition of the what's happening in terms of smartphones and even in terms of commerce? People in some countries now are not carrying credit cards or bank cards. You know, is that part of the process? We're decarding in general and moving towards a digital, whether it's commercially or in terms of identity. Is that informing part of this?
It's certainly part of the context in which the decision was made. I wouldn't say it was a direct factor, but certainly we are modernizing the way we deliver services, and as we do that, we recognize that more and more these transactions will be done online, electronically, using a smartphone, using your home computer, and that reinforces our assessment that the actual physical card is not something that is required for us to deliver our services effectively and efficiently.
The $1,000 fine and the potential of imprisonment of term not more than 1 year. But what was the rationale for the $1,000 penalty? Why $1,000?
That is a number that was already in the Act.
Okay.
So that is not a new provision. I don't know if there's a specific methodology that would have been used to develop that, if there's a particular scale. But certainly, they want to have something in the Act to discourage inappropriate use and creation of cards. And as you are probably aware, recently it was also added to the criminal code, making the creation and collection of things such as social insurance number card a criminal offense.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Bryson. See nothing further, then I want to thank Mr. Boyd. I want to thank you for being with us here today and giving us an overview of this division of the bill. And thank you. And we will call officials from Parks Canada forward to discuss Division 9, Parks Canada Agency. I want to welcome you to the committee and encourage you, if you have any overview you want to make of the division for members, and then we'll proceed to questions from members.
Good morning.
Good morning.
My name is Margaret Strizio. I'm responsible for strategic planning and reporting Parks Canada, and I'm joined this morning by Jonah Mitchell, who's responsible for law enforcement. Division 9 of the bill proposes changes in 2 areas for Parks Canada. The first relates to collaboration for environmental enforcement activities, and this is covered by clauses 315, 16, 322, and 323. So Mr. Mitchell will take the committee through those clauses, and then I'll speak to the remaining clauses that deal with streamlining of planning and reporting. Okay.
Just for context, currently park wardens enforcement activity is limited to the agency mandate for national parks, national historic sites, and national marine conservation areas. Clause 315 would allow for park wardens to assist other ministers to enforce their acts and regulations outside of parks and sites with the following constraints. The act or regulation must relate to the environment. The act or regulation must be listed in the schedule to the Parks Canada Agency Act. The location of the enforcement activity must be such that it is more convenient and efficient for park wardens to respond than other federal enforcement officers. There must be an agreement to provide these enforcement activities on behalf of the other minister, and park wardens must be designated to enforce the other act and trained. Essentially, the intent of the changes is to allow for faster and lower cost response to environmental enforcement incidents, particularly in remote areas in the north, where Environment Canada does not have an ongoing presence, but Parks Canada has a park with a park warden nearby who could act on their behalf. Clause 316 allows for the Governor and Council to add acts and regulations to the schedule of the Parks Canada Agency Act, for which park wardens could assist other bodies in enforcement activities. And then finally, Clause 322 and 323 restructures the schedules to the Act to add Part 3 and 4 for the listing of the associated regulations.
Okay, I'll deal first with Clause 320 because Clause 317 is consequential to it. Clause 320 removes the requirement for Parks Canada Agency to prepare a corporate plan and annual report by repealing Section 33 and 34 of the Parks Canada Agency Act. As a consequence, Clause 317 would remove the reference to the corporate plan in subsection 21.3. These documents duplicate the information that is in the report on plans and priorities and the departmental performance report that Parks Canada must produce each year because of where it's placed on the schedule under the FAA. So we will continue to do the departmental performance report and the report on plans and priorities each year, but the duplicated report will be removed. Moving to Clause 318, this amendment would extend the timeline for the preparation and tabling of a report on the overall state of our parks and sites from every 2 years to every 5 years. Changes to the overall state of our parks and sites, things like ecological integrity, commemorative integrity, it takes longer than 2 years to see an appreciable change, so a 5-year time frame is much more appropriate and will allow for a more meaningful report and more analysis in terms of trends, etc. Moving to Clause 319. This would extend the timeline for the review and tabling of management plans for each National Historic Site and National Park, or for each National Historic Site from 5 years to at least every 10 years. Management plans are long-term strategic plans with a 10 to 15-year time horizon. They set out the vision, the key strategies, and long-term objectives for the place related to natural resource management, cultural resource management, visitation, and stakeholder relations, for example. So 10 years is a more appropriate time frame and allows us to focus on implementing the plan over that time period and working with our stakeholders in implementing the plan and moving towards those long-term strategic targets that we've set out in the management plan. This changed time frame is reflected through an amendment to the Parks Canada Agency Act for historic sites. Clause 324 includes the same changed time frame for management plans in the Canada National Parks Act for national parks, and Clause 325 makes the same change to the Canada National Marine Conservation Area Act for marine conservation areas. And finally, Clause 321 removes the requirement for an annual audit of Parks Canada financial statements and an annual review of its performance information in its annual report. And this would be through repealing Section 36 of the Parks Canada Agency Act. We would continue to report on our performance annually through the departmental performance report, and our financial statements would continue to be completed and would be made public via a link to the departmental performance report, but there would no longer be the Auditor General's audit of the financial statements. And this item was already raised in Division 1 of Part 4 of the bill, where a number of organizations are having the same types of changes made by the Office of the Auditor General. And I think that was discussed last night. Thank you.
Yes, it was. Yeah. Thank you very much for your opening remarks. And we'll begin avec Monsieur Maille, s'il vous plaît.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Merci.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, witness. For me, Parks Canada, and for many Canadians, Parks Canada is very important. It's part of our country, and it's one of the most important parts of our country. So I'd like to know if the changes that you mentioned here will have an impact on the opening hours of the parks. I understand that the wardens will have to accomplish other tasks for Environment Canada. So will this have an impact on the access to the parks?
In particular?
Workload, mais plus au niveau de l'ouverture.
Workload, but opening hours, access of the public to the parks, because if the warden has to leave, go work on another project for Environment Canada, does that mean Canadians will not have access to the park?
Seasons of our parks. This is solely for enforcement-related activities. So if there were a situation, for example, a good example would be in the Gaspésie Peninsula, where there are a couple of migratory bird sanctuaries, Rocher-Percé and Île de Bonaventure, that are Environment Canada's enforcement officers respond to those locations from Quebec City. We have a small number of park wardens who do enforcement in Foyon National Park, and it's much closer in terms of travel distance for our wardens to have authorities to respond to enforcement incidents in those migratory bird sanctuaries on behalf of Environment Canada. That's probably the best example, but this doesn't have any impact on other parts of Parks Canada's operations, like the visitor services, the campgrounds.
Donc, au niveau des heures ou quoi que ce soit, ça n'affecte pas les...
So concerning the opening hours of parks, it will have no impact? No. Now, the fact that Parks Canada must help Environment Canada, is that linked to the cuts in Environment Canada? We hear that many jobs were eliminated in Environment Canada, so is it linked to this?
There won't be any impact on the operations of Environment Canada, to my knowledge. This is only to provide for more efficient response times to enforcement incidents. In terms of impacts on Environment Canada's operations, this was seen as a reduction in terms of costs associated with travel for Environment Canada.
Mais avant les coupures qu'il y a eu chez Environnement Canada,
But before the cuts to Environment Canada in the past, people from Environment Canada would have done these work. We hear that there were cuts of 600 jobs to Environment Canada, more so with the budget. So do you think that now, because Environment Canada has less staff to do this work, that explains why Park Canada must now do the work?
In terms of reduction to their amount of the work that Environment Canada is responsible for, whether we are taking on work that is a reduction to them. No, that's not the case, to the best of my knowledge, with Environment Canada. Their officers are centrally located, generally in urban centres, so this is purely a more efficient response time. We're not going to be replacing and there's not a reduction in their authorities or their...
Could you confirm? Does that mean that with these changes, Parks Canada would not have the responsibility to prepare an annual plan, or do you still have to prepare an annual plan?
To enforcement?
No,
to reporting?
Reporting.
Reporting, okay.
In terms of our planning and reporting, we would, like all departmental organizations, we would still prepare a report on plans and priorities that would be tabled in the House, and a departmental performance report each year reporting back on how we've done relative to our plan, and that would be tabled as well. So basically we'd have the same accountability reporting as other departmental organizations.
Okay. Okay. Et nous, on avait...
Well, we had certain concerns concerning the fact that the Auditor General could not look into this. What would be the impact on the responsibility or the accountability of Parks Canada, since the Auditor General will not be making any audits?
We would still continue to report on our performance in our departmental performance report, as do other organizations. What would be different is that the Auditor General wouldn't come in and ask to see the evidence that we had indeed achieved the performance that we were reporting. And that was an anomaly for just 3 separate agencies that were created around the late 90s, early 2000s. That requirement was there. There isn't that requirement for any other departmental organization or Crown Corporation, so it was felt to be that that level of oversight wasn't required. And it's been in place for about 10 years, and everything's gone very well for these new organizations, including Parks Canada. So it was felt to be not a requirement, but we would continue to report on our performance every year, as other organizations do. The same thing for the financial statements. We would continue to do financial statements. They would be presented to our external audit committee, but they wouldn't have the audit by the Office of the Auditor General. So we would be on the same footing as other departmental organizations.
Thank you. Thank you. We'll go to Ms. McLeod, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and certainly I appreciated that very specific example. And having done work in remote locations, I can remember, a health nurse for the federal government doing immunizations, and someone having to drive 4 hours to immunize one baby for the provincial, and it just always seemed like such a terrible waste of time and resources. So I really appreciate this move in terms of a little bit more flexibility with the role. Now, I guess just to clarify, this would only relate to federal statutes and enforcement, or has there been any conversations in terms of some opportunities for provincial collaboration?
At this point, this is seen as federal in terms of designating some of our officers under acts administered by Environment Canada.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. McLeod. Mr. Bryson, please.
Just the decision on the change to the audit approach, were they initiated by the Auditor General in terms of part of his general decision to reduce audit functions of agencies? So this, his office approached Parks Canada.
In fact, in this case, we had raised it with the Office of the Auditor General that we deal with on an ongoing basis, and they had indicated to us that they were also looking at the same thing from their side, so it was kind of a mutual discussion on that.
And I guess we'll have the Auditor General before committee and have an opportunity to discuss that. I think for a lot of us, the idea of reducing in any way audit function of government, I speak as a former Minister of Public Works, where, this is something that on an ongoing basis, constructive audit functions are very important, whether from the Auditor General or Controller General or what, but it's something that that is we're watching closely, and we're interested in having the discussion as to how in this age, particularly during a period of expenditure review, reducing audit function, how that is it a feeling that perhaps at some point the audit function had become too onerous, that it wasn't really from a cost-benefit analysis, that it was not really benefiting, and perhaps audit function had gone too far? Is that part of the consideration?
I don't believe so. I think that because all other departmental organizations don't have a requirement for an audit of their financial statements on an individual basis, they're all audited through the kind of the rolled up Government of Canada accounts, but individually they don't undergo an audit of their financial statements. And so the few organizations that through their own enabling legislation had this requirement added, it was felt that there was no need for these particular organizations to be singled out with a different requirement than the others in terms of risk. So I think the Auditor General was looking at where are the risks and rather to do it on a more risk-based approach.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Bryson. I have Mr. Mai.
Juste continuer un petit peu là-dessus.
I'd like to continue on that point. You mentioned the reports would be audited by an external auditor. Could you give us more specifics on that point?
Just to clarify that, all departments have an audit committee that consists of external members, and so that committee reviews all matters and all internal audits that are conducted by the organization, and they also review our performance report and would review our financial statements. But that's certainly not an audit that would be taking place. That's just, it does get reviewed by our audit committee, and the audit committee in its terms of reference does have the authority to request an external audit to be conducted on the organization. So they do have that authority. So there is a bit of oversight there.
So if there were to be an external audit, who would do the auditing?
Someone would need to be engaged to do that work.
So it would be a private firm?
That's right.
Rather than having the Auditor General do the verification?
That's right.
And right now, is that the case, where it's an external, private external company that does the auditing, or is because we have the Auditor General doing the job, we don't need to have someone else do the job?
Yeah. So the Auditor General has always done an annual audit. So going forward, there would no longer be an audit of our financial statements, and it would, I don't know of the intention to have the financial statements audited on an individual basis going forward, but they do have the authority to do so if they felt that there was a need. Otherwise, our financial statements would just be reviewed in the rolled up overall public accounts that is done by the Auditor General.
Do you have an idea of the cost that it would be in order to have the external auditing, if any?
Yeah. I can give you just an estimate in terms of each year the Auditor General estimates how many hours it will take for them to conduct an audit. So for the financial statement audit in their audit plan this year, they had estimated 2,700 hours. And for the performance information review, they had estimated 1,000 hours. So it's quite a bit of time. I can't figure out what that would be, but I guess we could do a rough estimate of that.
So if there were to be external auditing, would consider about 1,000 plus 20 hours specifically, just to look at to replace what the Auditor General is doing in terms of hours?
About 3,700 hours. 3,700.
3,700. And you don't have do you have an idea of how much that would cost?
They do give a cost, and I think that came out for them. They estimated $590,000.
And do you consider that would be cheaper? Would be more expensive to do it externally?
I would suppose so.
Okay. And you know how much, in terms of cost saving, it's about 3,700 hours per year in terms of the Auditor General doing the work for an annual report. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to thank our officials from Parks Canada for being here today. We appreciate your time with us and for giving an overview of that division. Colleagues, we did Division 10 and Division 11 last night, So we will be moving to Division 12. Integrated Cross-Border Law Enforcement Operations Act. And we have Joe Oliver. The real Joe Oliver. We have Mr. Oliver from the RCMP to address. And Mr. Oliver, if you want to give an overview of this division, and then we'll have questions from members.
Actually, I'm Stephen Bolton from the Department of Public Safety.
Okay.
My colleague from the RCMP, Joe Oliver, is in security, and he's on his way up.
Okay. I can't read your name, actually.
Oh.
Someone...
Yes, I can.
Okay. There we go. All right.
So I'll start again.
Welcome, Mr. Bolton, to the committee, and please give us an overview of this division.
Of course. Mr. Oliver, the RCMP, Joe Oliver, will be joining us momentarily to get through security. I'm here to speak to the shipwriter operation part of the BIA. Division 12 of the BIA is required in order to implement regularized shipwriter operations between Canada and the United States. Shipwriter enables specially trained and designated Canadian and U.S. law enforcement officers to conduct seamless, continuous law enforcement operations across the border on shared waters. This new and innovative cooperative policing model not only leverages law enforcement resources more efficiently, but has proven to be a more effective method of detecting and interdicting cross-border criminality. Just to give you a sense of it, the idea is that there would be these police law enforcement vessels in shared waters on the Canada-U.S. border, and they would be jointly crewed by Canadian and U.S. law enforcement. It's very important to note that all shipwriter operations will be conducted under the direction and control of law enforcement officers of the host country. So in Canada, under the control and the direction of Canadian law enforcement, and in Canada would be conducted in accordance with Canadian laws, policies, and procedures, and the same on the U.S. side. Looking at some of the key elements of this legislation, the Act would define the scope of operations for shipwriter, specify the authorities being granted to designated officers, outline the role of the Canadian Central Authority, which would be responsible for managing the day-to-day operations, specify the appointment process, including the mandatory criteria for appointment, outline how the seizure of goods and detention of persons are to be managed in Canada, and establish a civilian oversight mechanism for the conduct of designated officers. Legislation seeking to implement shipwriter has twice been introduced to Parliament, the latest being former Bill S13, which died on the order paper when Parliament was dissolved in March 2011. Regularizing shipwriter operations will permit the government to realize one of the key law enforcement commitments in the Canada-U.S. Beyond the Border Action Plan. Importantly, it would also allow Canada to ratify the Shipwriter Framework Agreement signed by the Public Safety Minister and the Homeland Secretary back in May 2009. With this legislation in place, it is hoped that regularized shipwriter operations could be implemented this summer. And this is the cavalry riding in, or the mounted cavalry riding in. This is my colleague, Joe Oliver, Director General, Border Integrity, the RCMP.
Oliver, and if you have any opening remarks on this division, we'd certainly welcome them.
I have no opening remarks. Look forward to questions, okay. Mr. Chair. Thank you.
And at this point, we'll start members' questions avec Monsieur Caron, s'il vous plaît.
Well, my question, this measure was not announced in the budget of the 29th of March, if I'm correct.
No, it's my understanding there are no funding requirements attached to the budget.
No funding requirements. Okay.
Yeah.
Qui me porte à ma prochaine question.
Which brings me to my next question. For the operations included in this section, what would be the costs and how would they be spread out? Would there be any supplementary costs associated with these measures?
There is no funding request in the legislation. What's intended here is legislation that would frame and govern shipwriter operations in the future.
Et ça serait sous l'autorité de la...
And this would be under the authority of the RCMP?
Est-ce que vous avez une idée pourquoi?
Do you have an idea why such a proposal is made in the Budget Adoption Act if there are no budgetary consequences?
Government, and we cannot speak to that.
Ok, c'est bien compris.
So that's understood. That's it for me for the present time.
Yeah, just thank you very much for joining us today. During the Senate study on Bill S13, some of the senators wanted to know, again, it's an issue of cost, the costs of this legislative measure, and they were told that the RCMP would be able to absorb the costs and requirements of the implementation, but we've already had the Auditor General warn that the RCMP can't absorb further costs for additional requirements without compromising operations. Given that concern, can't you give us some specific costing figures of what it will cost to implement these measures? Because I think we all share the concerns of the RCMP resources being stretched further given the constraints they're already under.
Yeah, if I could speak to that. I think it's important to recognize that today RCMP conducts on-water operations in shared waters with the United States. The challenge is that because of the fact that law enforcement in Canada and U.S. respect jurisdiction, our ability to pursue criminals across the border into each other's territories is limited by the fact that we are empowered under Canadian law and not U.S. law. And as a consequence, there have been instances where suspect vessels which we tried to intercept have fled into the U.S. territory and evaded apprehension and subsequent prosecution. Even with our existing resources today, there will be this bill will give us the legislative authority to jointly crew vessels with specially trained officers from Canada and the U.S. so that the barrier is not so that the border is not a barrier to current cross-border law enforcement operations. So even in the absence of dedicated funding for this type of activity, we currently conduct operations, and those operations would be enhanced by this increased operational flexibility to operate with our American counterparts across the border. In fact, we would leverage each other's finite resources to bring better effect to cross-border crime fighting both in Canada and the U.S.
To what extent would your activities be, for instance, around the issue of, say, drug interdiction or that area? I mean, is that a significant part of what you're doing?
Yes, it would be. On an annual basis, the integrated border enforcement teams conduct a national threat assessment, Canada-U.S., and what we identified is that cross-border crime is a two-way problem. Contraband flows in both directions. If I could generalize, marijuana, ecstasy flows from Canada to the United States, cocaine from the U.S. into Canada. People are smuggled in both directions. Currency is smuggled in both directions. Contraband cigarettes from the U.S. to Canada, and firearms from the U.S. to Canada. Now, in the deployment of our operations, we look at these threat assessments to identify where are the greatest threats and where we would deploy these resources to bring the greatest effect to our operations. There are high-risk areas along the Canada-U.S. border that would certainly benefit from a tool such as this legislative authority. And, to name some, in areas particularly where the border is only short distance between the two nations and where smugglers can quickly cross the border and deliver contraband from one side to the other.
Is there a significant delta in terms of resources between U.S. Coast Guard and RCMP?
I think in terms of, the U.S. Coast Guard is a maritime law enforcement entity. It has a multi-mission, also includes search and rescue and so forth. They have a very significant presence. The RCMP, we have, I think, a much smaller presence, but I think the beauty of the construct that we've developed here is that it's completely reciprocal, and that the Commissioner and the Commandant decide how these operations will be deployed. And it is essentially, when we deploy these operations, it is an equal number. So an equal number of Canadian vessels to an equal number of U.S. vessels, which then gives us the operational flexibility to operate back and forth across the border.
Yeah, I guess so. That would allay any fears of us effectively outsourcing the monitoring to a better resourced agency in the U.S. You're saying that it's a fairly symmetrical.
When we deploy these operations, these are deployed based on threat. They're deployed based on need. And when we do deploy them, there are equal number of officers that are cross-designated. The U.S. cannot summarily decide on its own to cross-designate officers to operate in Canada. That's the authority of the Commissioner to grant U.S. officers that cross-designation authority, as set out in the framework agreement in terms of what we've agreed, as well as in the legislation.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I just wanted to clarify a couple of points. First of all, the relationship of CBSA with respect to the frame. My understanding is they're not involved in the framework agreement. Can one or both of you or just clarify relationship with CBSA?
I think we both could, but CBSA is not involved in this. They're not involved in the framework agreement, nor in Shiprider, in the sense that CBSA's mandate is primarily at the ports of entry. And just given the nature of this with the waterways, it's more between the ports of entry. So the mandate falls more to the RCMP and potentially to other provincial police forces.
Okay. And do you want to comment on that, Mr. Oliver?
So I would just add that the framework agreement specifies from a Canadian perspective that members of the RCMP and members of police officers empowered under provincial legislation. So there is no other federal law enforcement. So as a consequence, CBSA would not fall under the framework agreement.
Is there any consideration being given to the land component, adding a land component, or working on a land component agreement? Is there any need to do so with this area?
If I could speak to it, I think what we've done with the Shiprider framework agreement, it was one of the first times that we've tried this innovative law enforcement practice along the Canada-U.S. border. So we're mindful of concerns that may have been raised around sovereignty and so forth. So to mitigate that and to test the concept, the first deployment of this was in the maritime environment, which is a very, very clearly defined boundary, and we limited to the U.S. Coast Guard and the RCMP in order to integrate. We're talking about the integration of operational cultures, operational standard procedures, training, and so forth. So in order to test it, it was evaluated and then improved and tested and evaluated to the point that both governments saw value in this as an innovative law enforcement practice that would increase the crime fighting capability of both Canadian and U.S. law enforcement entities. Now, based on the lessons learned from Shiprider, there is a commitment in the Beyond the Border Action Plan to follow how Shiprider evolved and bring it to the land environment and test it there as well. So in the Beyond the Border, there is an action plan. There is a commitment that the governments of the Canada-U.S. have made in terms of testing this concept in the land environment.
And I think that answers a previous question with respect to, in general, what's the relationship with the budget? I mean, you mentioned the Beyond the Border Action Plan, but the action plan on perimeter security, economic competitiveness, I mean, this is very much related. It's very much under the umbrella of that whole action plan. That's my understanding. Is that correct?
Precisely. The action plan under the elements of cross-border law enforcement includes two very key components. One is the regularization of Shiprider. So one of the commitments government of Canada and the U.S. have made is ratifying Shiprider and deploying these operations. The second element is testing, building on the lessons learned from Shiprider and the integrated border enforcement teams to test this concept in the land environment.
Okay. I appreciate that, and that is, just for members' reference, on page 103 of the budget document. Thank you very much. That's all the questions I have. Go to Mr. Marston, please.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and welcome. We visited Windsor as a committee, and we had discussions with the Canada Border Services about chases at times that occur across the bridge, and so just so I understand clearly, the things that are being considered in the future would be a joint force which would have the capacity to go past the gates of the bridge, for instance, into Canada if they were in pursuit?
I don't think the concept is that clean, and because I think what we have to look at is, and particularly with respect to ShipRider, because we know what ShipRider does, we've deployed ShipRider and we know how it works. In ShipRider, it's a planned operation in most cases, where officers from both countries are cross-designated and they are co-crewed. So a key element of the ShipRider Framework Agreement and the legislation itself is that this has to be an integrated maritime law enforcement operation on a jointly crewed vessel with cross-designated officers who have received special training. And it is very much built on the fact that sovereignty still applies. So when in Canada, Canadian laws still apply. It's just that the U.S. officers are now acting in Canada under the direction of Canadian officers, and they're essentially backup to the Canadian officers. And if there was a situation where Canadian officers are in U.S. territory, they're actually acting as U.S. officers supporting the U.S. lead law enforcement agency.
Well, I would suspect, whereas pre-planned, that if they came to the shoreline, there would already be other police force personnel there from the host country.
Correct. And that is why that if you look at the legislation, it confines us to the maritime environment, and the framework agreement specifies that there are only rare instances where a pursuit can be continued on land. And that might be a situation where surveillance commenced in the United States, the vessel was followed into Canadian waters, it hit the shore, the suspect fled, then the ShipRider officers would have the authority in those very rare instances to continue the pursuit on land, but they must coordinate with the on-land or Canadian resources. Now, based on the construct that we have, where you have 3 RCMP officers and 1 U.S. Coast Guard officer, the decision may be made by the lead Canadian officer that the U.S. Coast Guard officer, you stay with the vessel, that the RCMP officers who have full authority in Canada would continue with the foot chase. So those are things that are being worked out in the important part, which is the training, where these scenarios are actually practiced time and time again for these officers, so they become ingrained in how they do business when they work together.
You spoke about surveillance of a suspect, and quite often that's aerial surveillance. And of course, at least from my understanding, the U.S. side of the border has a lot more availability of sophisticated equipment, both manned or unmanned. And some people have some concerns about privacy rights here in Canada relative to that. What would you expect the implications are of the proposed provisions of this act, in the use of aerial support?
The framework agreement provides for the opportunity for air officers or air observers to be cross-designated. Now, I think the important element to understand about this support, aerial support, and it is only support, they are not involved in direct law enforcement, is that they essentially become the eye in the sky for the vessels that are on the water. If you look in certain areas along the border, there are a number of small islands where suspects could easily hide and fall out of the line sight of a vessel working on the water. Having aerial support, it would provide the opportunity for the air officer, the air observer, to direct the officers to where the suspect has fled. Another important element is that any operation conducted in Canada must be under the direction of a Canadian officer and consistent with the constitutional framework in Canada, as well as the legal requirements in Canada.
I guess pardon me?
30 seconds.
A natural follow-up for me would be, could you envision a case where a drone was used to fly over Canadian land?
At this point, we know that the Customs and Border Protection has a drone along the Canada-U.S. border. At this point, we haven't worked that type of equipment or technology into our concept of operations. However, in the future, we are always looking to leverage technology, as we are on the Canadian side, exploiting technology in order to enhance the ability of our finite resources to achieve the best outcomes possible. And, what the future brings, I think we still have to study that. But at this point, that type of concept is not worked into our concept of operations.
About sovereignty issues. I say I'd be concerned about sovereignty issues, considering that.
Thank you. Monsieur Maia, s'il vous plaît.
Mr. Oliver, you mentioned about the fact that a lot of the contraband, and you mentioned the fact that commerce of marijuana from Canada going to the U.S. Is that mostly through the water crossing, or would, in terms of, if we look at the proportion, water versus land or air, what would be do you have an idea?
I don't think we've broken it down into those very finite streams. What I can say is that smugglers are very quick to respond to operational or law enforcement posture. And, sometimes because of our processes and procedures, we're not so quick to respond. So it's easy for smugglers to modify. They may smuggle by land today, they may smuggle by water tomorrow, and they're even using aircraft, so general aviation or smaller aircraft. So I think the benefit of a tool like ShipRider gives us that flexibility that removes the border as a barrier and allows us to have greater operational flexibility in terms of how we deliver law enforcement services along the Canada-U.S. border.
And again, coming back to marijuana, do you have an idea of the quantity or the amount of smuggling being done?
That is very difficult to estimate because, unfortunately, organized crime doesn't file annual returns as to what they've smuggled. But we do keep statistics on our interceptions and on the increase and decrease of seizures. Overall volumes, I don't have that number, but when you compare to the overall seizures that are directed towards the United States, the proportion of marijuana being smuggled into the United States is a fraction of what is produced domestically in the U.S. or smuggled across their southern border.
Do you have an idea of the fraction?
I don't have a number. I would have to go back to our threat documents to look at that.
Maybe we'll have to send the Auditor General on that. Thank you very much.
Okay, I have one more questioner. I'm not sure why the bells are ringing. We're going to check that. But, okay, une question.
En fait, c'est à la suite des questions que je vous ai posées.
Well, it's a follow-up to the questions I asked before. At the present time, with the Budget Implementation Act, we have this integrated aspect. You said there will be no financial impact. We are the Finance Committee. You say it's a government decision. I understand that. But with something so important for public security, have you had the opportunity to present this ShipRider project to the Public Security Committee before so they could analyze it?
Estimates? No.
Au niveau du fonctionnement.
No. For the functioning of the program, the ShipRider program.
That the committee, the Senate committee has studied this on 2 occasions in relation to Bill S-13 and most recently in relation to the pre-study they are doing for Bill C-38.
Mais à votre connaissance, il n'y a pas eu de discussion.
To your knowledge, there was no discussion on the Public Security Committee of the House of Commons?
At least I haven't been called to testify. Yeah.
Witnesses for being here, for giving us an overview and responding to our questions on this section of the bill. Colleagues, we will break and we will see you back here at 3:30 p.m. I'll just point out, if you want to leave some of your papers here at your place, you can certainly do so. This committee will be, I think it's locked up or will be reserved for us at that time. So, thank you. Meeting adjourned.